Make yourselves comfortable and listen closely, for I think we will have a long talk. The topic we're embarking on is rather extensive. We will be talking about sex behavior, about sex in general. It all started with a lecture I was invited to hold at the Medical Academy by Professor Kamenov for the sexual medicine course. I started asking myself questions. Why do we have sex? What is the sense of it? Why is it so important to us, and what is it at all? So I dived deep into this topic, into my favorite neuroscience. I started digging into the brain. I discovered so many things, I had to share them with you. What is the brain's role in sex? Is there a difference between sex in humans and animals? What is the connection between sex and reproduction? Why are there homosexual relations? Why do we have sex for pleasure? Why do we cheat? What is love? What is the meaning of an orgasm? What is the difference between the male and female orgasm? How necessary are hormones for sex? Where does aggression come in sex? What is the role of our ancestors, our origins, in our sex and sexual behavior? So this is not a sexology lecture, but something that will intrigue you. Before I begin, allow me to set some ground rules. First rule: remember, we reproduce with our sex organs, our sex systems, but we have sex with the brain. Our sexual organ is in fact the brain. Love, with so many poems, plays and works of art dedicated to it, is here, in the head, not here in the heart. Love is a brain function, as tantalizing as that may sound. The second thing I have also mentioned in other medcasts that you should not forget, and we must remind ourselves, is that we have a conscience. It is composed of our brain. It uses it for information. But the conscience is not what determines its actions in many cases. What I have told you many times is that the brain is a universal game system. It constantly plays games. It bets, wins and loses. It remembers its old games, respectively how it played and what the result was. It remembers what brought joy and pleasure and rewards itself when it manages to win a game. This is our brain, a great system, but not entirely perfect and immaculate. And thus, I commence probably the most boring part of our talk, because I will speak a bit about the structure of the brain. It is really important, dear friends. So do not skip forward past these words on the different parts of the brain, because that is where all connections and functions that we will talk about begin and crystallize. In my hand I have a pebble. Look at how interesting it is. It is precisely the size and pretty much the form of the limbic system in the brain. The limbic system is what determines our fears, desires, urges, hates, aggressions, sexual behaviors, and affections. All of this is crammed into such a small space. It is composed of a hypothalamus that has nuclei. It is not necessary to remember these anachronic structures, but let us mention them. Other than the hypothalamus, we have the thalamus. Above it lies the diencephalon. There are two structures in the limbic system that we call the amygdala. These are the two centers on both sides of the brain that contain fear, dread, aggression, everything we feel when we are scared, edgy, or aggressive. The limbic system is the starting point for two types of fibers that we medics define as two types of autonomic nervous system. You might have heard them. One is called the sympathetic and the other parasympathetic. The parasympathetic is the one in charge of our body when we are relaxed, when we sleep, dream, rest, when we're calm. The sympathetic does the exact opposite. It is linked to action, to doing something. These two systems constantly turn on and off. I'm explaining this because later on in the sexual behavior, the game of these two systems appears to be very important. And at the end, before concluding my anatomy lecture, I will mention another significant structure that sets us apart from many other animal species, our frontal cortex, the anterior part of the brain. That is where our fantasies, our memories, and our previous experiences reside. Our memory images are processed there. It simultaneously builds our fantasies, and it also plays the role of a brake. Unlike in some animal species, where if a male wants to have sex with a female, it goes straight to her and starts acting, the frontal cortex in humans is the brake that says, no, you mustn't do that, or at least you need something prior to it. And now we will get on to the more interesting part, speaking about the frontal cortex and sex in animals. Sex in animals is very similar to ours. As I was reading and preparing this material, it turned out that in most lower animal species, sex and reproduction are equal. The female has one estrus, and during it they mate. Yes, we have sex for pleasure, and it has nothing to do with reproduction. If any of you think we are the only animal species to do that, you're wrong. Orcas and dolphins also have sex for pleasure. Most primates, apes, also have sex for pleasure. What is curious as we delve into the field among animals is that in primates, sex is not only a method for pleasure and reward for the brain, but also a tool for social communication and building a hierarchy in their troops or prides. Is there a difference between the female and male brain, as I said? That is, if an anatomist had only a brain in front of them, could they tell whether they have a male or female brain at hand? It turns out that the answer is yes. There are major differences in our development, notably where I mention the limbic system. One of the things we will speak about later on is a widely known nucleus of the hypothalamus, INAH3, which is the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. It turns out it is much larger in women than in men. This is one major difference. Furthermore, the limbic system and the links it creates in the male and female brain, the part of hypothalamus, the nuclei responsible for sex, part of them actually go to the amygdala. Can you guess in which sex? In men. It turns out that in men the nuclei responsible for sex have a direct connection to the nuclei responsible for aggression, attack, fear, and dread. This is why aggressive sexual behavior is much widespread among men than in women. A great study in the 90s that I will get back to later researched the brains of dead gay men. One of the great neuroanatomists, Simon LeVay, found something interesting. The brain of gay men, and notably the nucleus I mentioned, INAH3, is exactly the same as in a woman's brain, unlike the other men's brains. This was a basis for gay men to adopt the idea of different sizes and thinking, but I will stop here, because I will speak in much greater detail about homosexuality later on in our MEDcast. So as these parts of the brain are still fresh in your minds and knowledge, let's move on to part of these functions and a unique phenomenon formed by these functions. The orgasm. The most astonishing thing in the human species is the female orgasm. You might ask why. Let me start by explaining that in both sexes, the orgasm originates in the sexual pleasure of the parasympathetic, but what we call the climax or culmination is when the sympathetic takes over. So it is the point of switching from the parasympathetic to the sympathetic. Why is the female orgasm extremely weird from a biological point of view? Because it has nothing to do with reproduction. Many women can experience orgasm without working on conception, and vice versa. Many women can conceive without ever having experienced an orgasm. A woman can first have many orgasms. If we consider the menstrual cycle, it is curious that around the time of ovulation in women, sexuality and orgasms are strongest, but what is mysterious, again a brain game, is that the second peak of orgasms is around the 27th to 28th day. Why? Because that is when the conscience, the brain, is relieved of the fear that the woman may conceive. This peak isn't as high as the first one around ovulation, but it exists. We should now mention that the animal species that mate for pleasure have a very well-developed prefrontal cortex. That is, they have sexual fantasies. We are speaking about dolphins, orcas, our close cousins the apes, and of course us. Sex for pleasure originates not directly in relation to reproduction, but as a function of the frontal cortex in the brain. In sexual communication and pleasure from sex, physiologists have seen that the brain activates different structures in men and women. I will not bother you with them. You don't need to remember them, but I will say that in women, the ventromedial nuclei of the hypothalamus are involved, as well as the diencephalon. And something we have from ancient times is the spinal reflex. A woman can experience sexual pleasure upon touching her spine, whereas men experience no such thing. In men, as I said, the amygdala is intertwined. It is responsible for fear, aggression, and motivation too. In men, different parts are activated, the medial preoptic area. And another thing, the man has a remnant of ancient times in orgasms in the form of the mammary reflex. That is, the breasts are sensitive and erogenous zones in men. As you know, men do not breastfeed. This has remained in their brain to use these parts without biological sense. we spoke about reward and what we call orgasm. I will instantly say that you all know that in men and women, orgasms are completely different. Although the same fibers are used in the peripheral nervous system, in the sympathetic and parasympathetic. However, the brain in women and men switches from one to the other very differently. In men, the sexual pleasure begins in the parasympathetic, and at the moment of ejaculation, the sympathetic comes into action. Immediately after sex, the parasympathetic is reactivated again. In women, the switch between the two systems is much slower, and this is why the orgasm experiences are very different between men and women. I said it all begins and ends with the brain. So what is the point of sex? You will understand why at the end of this MEDcast, but before that let me get back to reproduction. Why do sex and reproduction coincide in the lower species? Because the pleasure they experience from sex makes species reproduce exactly during the estrus period. As simple as that. And what is the point of reproduction? The goal is to leave as many copies as possible of your own genome. The idea is to reproduce the genome in us and leave more copies. That is the point, the meaning that the brain initially construes in sexual communication. I will share some interesting things about animal species. We have some like apes, for example, where there is an alpha male and several females. You might ask, so what? Not only are there several females, but they are also strictly hierarchically divided into first, second, third echelon. An important aspect of sexual communication is that first echelon females always give birth, in most cases, to a male, and lower echelons usually give birth to females. You might wonder, hold on, how? Isn't the sperm determinant? Yes. But the brain watches over what embryo has been fertilized. And when the female is from the third or fourth echelon, it is highly likely she would have a miscarriage in a male fetus. You're wondering, why do we care? If you open one of our science journals and publications, you'll see that women with recurring miscarriages have far more miscarriages of male fetuses than female ones. It is generally considered that the Y chromosome is one of the preconditions for more and frequent miscarriages. Furthermore, as we're speaking of sexual communication in primates, if you were a female that had her baby at night, in the morning, when the troop gathered, you would present your child. If you were a female from the first echelon, all would take a step back and congratulate you. If you were a third or fourth echelon female ape, do you know what would happen? First of all, they'd take your newborn, and the second and third echelon males would scrutinize it. Why? They'd be trying to determine the sex. Here is a curious bit of nature. If the baby were male, it could be killed by a second or third echelon male. But to avoid this, the mother has had sex not only with the alpha male, but also with the other male, so that when the male looks at the male baby, he decides it is his baby. Moving right along. In zoology, there are convergent and divergent species. Such species that are similar, where males and females have no differences whatsoever, are the convergent species. And the divergent species are the ones where the male is starkly different to the female, several times larger, with a different color, plumage, and so on. In the first case, in convergent species, there are more twins born. Why? Because in the case of death of one of the parents, say the mother, with them being absolutely equal, the other cares for the species. Whereas in a group with several females, or a couple of markedly different male and female, there is usually only one child at birth. This is because, should the mother die, there would be nobody left to care for the generation. The male usually has no commitments to the offspring. Notice another interesting thing. In the species that are very much alike, the convergent ones, cheating is more than 50% compared to the species with differences between sexes. Such studies have also been carried out in humans, and what is usually observed is that they show women different pictures of men, and when asked who they would prefer to have sex with, they choose men with massive jaws and cheekbones and big muscles. Interestingly, when asked who they would trust, these women chose men that have kinder eyes, more oval faces, less sculpted features, but they do not want to have sex with them. The same study was continued, and it was found that the more industrialized a country, the better off people are, the more these differences in characteristics disappear, which is the intransient symbol of female beauty over the tens of thousands of years ever since Homo sapiens has existed until today. I will give you a few seconds to try and answer this question yourselves. First option, big breasts. Second, big buttocks. Third, long legs. Fourth, thin waist. Fifth, thick lips. Sixth, long hair. Seventh, good skin. And final option, tall stature. If any of you guessed it was the thin waist, congratulations! I myself was confused and gave another answer when doing this test. If I were to introduce the topic of liking, I would have to say that a thin waist is a sign of fertility to a man's brain. If you remember our menopause MEDcast, I had told you that over time, fat begins accumulating in the abdominal area in women, and they start to look like they have the male kind of obesity when their hormones are short. A thin waist is a sign of fertility to the brain, and this is why this feature is always liked. To be completely honest, the male brain likes the waist-to-hip ratio in women. I cannot say the precise numbers, but I can tell you that a thinner waist and larger hips mean fertility to the brain. Hence, this woman will instantly be liked. It is a fact that our brains, without us recognizing it, like symmetrical beauty, that is a face with two similar halves. Why? Because this is an expression of healthy genes, of a healthy immune system, absence of illnesses to deform part of the face. So this is in our unconscious liking and preferences in sexual communication. If we look to animals, the plumage of the rooster and all males is actually a subconscious sign to the female's brain that they are in good shape, in good health, and have a good immune system. A good colourful plumage means a good immune system, which will result in a good offspring. Another interesting tidbit. Imagine a flock with one alpha male. Those males under him are usually his brothers or cousins. No others allowed because the genome does not allow for other copies to be left in the flock. But imagine just for a second that the alpha male dies, is either killed, or simply falls ill and passes away. Then we have a new alpha male, 80% of the females pregnant with the first alpha male's babies simultaneously miscarriage, with the exception of very few females that, although pregnant, manage to imitate an estrus so well that they secrete pheromones and smells like any female on heat, and she has sex with the new alpha male, although pregnant. Then the baby is born not in the 3rd month, but in the 1st, and still this alpha male accepts the baby as his own and believes that he is so great that he had a baby in the 1st month. I do not want to make comparisons to humans, but to cause an estrus or miscarriage respectively, it is not the immune system at play. It is the brain that orders the immune system to act. So once again, I'm sharing this story to convince you that it is all a game played by the brain that observes and determines, based on the environment, what is best for you. I have so much more interesting things to share. The vastness of this topic demands that we do a second part. I truly hope you found it interesting. And do not forget to be happy. Happiness makes sex good, just as sex makes happiness. I'll see you again soon.